Hello, everyone, and welcome to session 4 on Empirics for auctions and trading games. Our speakers are Shoshana Vasserman and Larsen both from Stanford. Shoshana starts talking about scaling auctions as insurance, a case study in procurement. Shoshana is happy to take questions at the end. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for having me. I'll be talking to you about scaling auctions as insurance. This is based on a project with my colleague Valentin Bolotnyy at the Hoover Institution. So let me start by saying a little bit about American infrastructure. This is a very large part of the public sector, large part of the economy. It constitutes about 2.5% of GDP annually, and almost 40% of that is spent on highways and bridges, which is what I'll be focusing on. It's also an area in which there's a lot of discussion, a lot of interest of collaboration between the public and private sector, and especially of public-private risk sharing. Part of this is because construction is often or typically done by private firms that are contracted to, but also because a lot of small firms are used sometimes intentionally. There are many programs that try to prioritize small firms as a way to boost economic activity. And over the last 10 years, there's been an increasing interest in longer-term private management of public works as a way to sort of shift responsibilities and incentives. And so this is quite an important area. And it's worth taking a minute to think about how uncertainty and risk aversion might intersect with this. As I mentioned, a lot of the firms that wind up doing the work are very small. You can call them, mom and pop, or more accurately, pop and sons. And they often specialize in work for the government. So each public procurement contract constitutes a very large portion of their annual revenues and is important to their bottom line. Construction projects are also, by nature, pretty uncertain. I'm told that anyone that has ever had work done on their house would find it quite intuitive that you plan to do a certain amount of work, and then once you go and start doing it, you find out that actually there's a burst pipe, there's a busted wall, and you need to do a lot more work that's very expensive beyond what you originally scoped out. And of course, with very, very large projects like roads and bridges, there's constantly changing conditions that can additionally add to the inherent uncertainty that was already there. And this is important when thinking about auction design, because a lot of the toolkit that we're used to working with risk neutral agents don't really apply once you have risk averse agents. Many of the results that we typically think of rely on revenue equivalence, which just doesn't hold, which has some nice properties. For example, it suggests that first price auctions are generally better, but it also means that the auctioneer's toolkit is now a lot larger. You can't just choose your optimal reserve price and call it a day. I mean, of course you can, but there's more that you can do. In particular, an auctioneer can typically get some gains out of trying to reduce risk. And there are a number of different dimensions on which you could reduce risk. One is by just trying to reduce the amount of uncertainty. So scope out the project better so that there are less surprises. Another is to try to ensure the risk averse agent by pre-committing to pay to cover for some of the uncertainty. These are maybe the more obvious ones. There are also some less obvious things that a risk neutral auctioneer could do, such as subsidizing entry costs and setting caps on the amount of risk that bidders are allowed to bid. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay. The application that I'll be focusing on is Massachusetts bridge construction and maintenance auctions, or auctions to procure work for construction and maintenance in Massachusetts. As a former resident of Massachusetts, I can tell you that bridges require quite a bit of work, and money is important because the annual budget for repairs is about $100 million, but the backlog is almost 40 times bigger. It's also worth pointing out that a lot of the firms that work on these kinds of projects are quite small. This is the website of the second most common bidder in the data set I'll tell you about. And I'm hoping that the 1990s style HTML will convince you that they're both specialized in these kinds of auctions. They say they've been working for 22 years. They've really focused on bridges, but this isn't a very large firm. The kind of auction that I'll be talking about is also quite common in the US. In fact, the same exact software that MassDOT uses is used by 40 other state departments of transportation, as well as other departments, and in fact, I think a couple of provinces in Canada. So maybe let me tell you about what these auctions are actually like. So the way that it usually works is that when the government wants to go and do some construction on a bridge, what they do is they have an internal engineer, someone who's responsible from the DOT, go out and spec out the whole project. And so he'll come out with a list of items that are required, that is to say, usually materials and work products that are required to complete the project. This is sometimes called the bill of quantities, I think, in the UK. And so what it'll look like is basically a list of of a unit number for every kind of thing that's involved. So maybe 20 tons of concrete, 30 traffic cones, etc. Every bidder sees that list and then has to submit a unit price for each one of these items. So for example, a bidder might ask for $5 for every traffic cone that's going to be used, $100 for every ton of concrete. And the winner is chosen based on the sum of the product of these unit price bids and the quantities that the government engineer has estimated. They run a first price auction, sealed bid, first price. And the only thing that's tricky here is that whoever wins the auction then has to go and fulfill the entire contract. They have to go and build the entire project. They have to pay for everything themselves. But because there's uncertainty about what's actually going to be used, it's fairly common that the engineer says that we'll need 20 tons of concrete, but in fact, it turns out that they need 25 or 30 or even 15. The winner is paid based on the quantities that are actually used rather than the ones that were estimated initially, multiplied by the unit bids that he had submitted. So the bids are committed, but the quantities might change. And so in these kinds of auctions, there are two kinds of uncertainty that have strategic importance. The first of which is the normal kind that we typically think of. You make some bid, there's some probability that you win and some probability that your opponents will have a better bid than you and beat you. But there's also uncertainty about what happens if you win, because conditional on winning, there's still uncertainty about the actual profits that you'll get. In particular, suppose that you bid down on concrete because you think it's not that important and you want to be competitive, and then it turns out that twice as much concrete actually needed to be used than was initially estimated. You might be on the hook for doing a lot of work at a loss. And it's worth pointing out that scaling auctions, this is the auction that I just described, actually does a lot of work to help insure bidders against the second kind of risk. First of all, they cover what's actually used. And so as long as you bid something on every item, you will definitely be compensated based on what's needed. This is in contrast to something that we might call like a lump sum auction, where you commit to the amount that you'll be paid ex ante, so that if you wind up needing to spend more money, you're totally on the hook for that. But that insurance is also kind of interesting, because what it turns into is that the bidder now has a sort of portfolio of risks that they can optimize over that looks kind of similar to the portfolio of risks that an asset manager has. You have a number of items, each of which has some projected expectations, and you can choose for yourself where you want to take those risks. Do you want to take a bet on concrete or traffic cones or whatever else, while trying to be maximally competitive because you still want to win the auction? Okay, so what I'm going to try to do for the rest of the talk is I'm going to argue that risk aversion in the context of these kinds of scaling auctions has three major implications. The first is that it implies some simple empirical predictions, ways that we can sort of see in the data that risk is important and that risk aversion is present. But actually, we can go a little bit farther, and we can use the portfolio problem to try to identify and estimate parts of the bidder's problem without making the same kinds of assumptions that we typically do, without thinking as much about the strategic environment, in terms of competition between bidders. And finally, just going back to a point I tried to make earlier, there's a big scope for market design once risk-averse agents are involved, and I'll talk about how we might be able to see that. So very briefly, I'll present a model for how to think about this, show some evidence that bidders in mass bridge auctions are risk-averse, and try to estimate some of the parameters that explain their problem, and give a hint of how this market design analysis could be done. Okay, so the main components of a scaling auction are basically 4 parts. As I mentioned, the first thing that comes up is this bill of quantities, this list of ex ante estimated quantities that the DOT engineer produces, QE, E for estimates. There's one for each item, and you can think of a project as consisting of lots of items. I think the median auction in my data set will have 67. So these are pretty big vectors. There's also a list of ex post quantities that are actually realized. This is the amount of concrete or traffic cones that's actually used in the project once all of the uncertainty is resolved. And then most of the items that are involved here, we typically think of as competitive commodities, things like concrete that have market rates that explain a lot of the unit cost for each one of them. And finally, each project is going to have a bunch of features that help explain why there's more or less uncertainty. For example, the project manager might be better or worse. There are different kinds of project types, etc. And I'm going to make 3 major assumptions with the caveat that I'll talk about how some of these might be relaxed in a bit. The first is that I'll focus on independent private types. Types are going to mostly involve costs, private costs and risk aversion. I'm going to assume that more heroically that all of the bidders have identical beliefs about the ex post quantities, and so there's no winner's curse. A way to think about that in a practical sense is that all of the information about historical quantities and historical auctions is public. And there's, I can show you a slew of software packages or software products, I guess, that are marketed to solve exactly this problem that everyone has access to in the open market. The final assumption is that bidders can't influence ex post quantities. And so from their perspective, the realization of uncertainty is independent of who they are. The uncertainty is inherent to the project and not to the bidder. And this is really an institutional fact, at least as far as I could gather. The DOT invests pretty heavily in trying to clamp down on potential moral hazard. There's basically an engineering manager who's on site at all times who has to approve any changes. And so to a first order approximation, it does seem like this is a reasonable assumption. Okay, although I tried to stick with a more general characterization, I hope you'll indulge me in a much more concrete model that I'll talk about relaxing later on, where we have bidders who have CAR utility with a common CAR coefficient gamma. Everyone has the same gamma within a project, so that the only heterogeneity in the auction really relies on an efficiency type or a cost multiplier. The idea there being that the difference, because most of the items involved are commodity goods, the main difference between bidder costs is really their ability, their economies of scale, their proximity to the project site, really their ability to shave costs across the board, and that would be in a multiplicative structure. So there's a single dimensional cost multiplier type alpha I. And finally, regarding the information structure, I'm going to assume that the bidders are doing something like what I described. They take the best software package available. That software package happens to run the same model that I will. And what that gives them is the belief structure in which ex post quantities are normally distributed around some projection. And that projection doesn't have to necessarily be centered on the DOT projections. It's just going to come from the best statistical model you can come up with. So where does that leave us? The bidder's problem is almost entirely described by their expected utility from participating in the auction. And this is the product of 2 things. It's a product of the expected utility upon winning, which is the sum of the ex post quantity of each item times the markup, the bid minus the cost that the bidder will have to pay for each one of these items, times the probability that the bidder will win. And it's worth noting that uncertainty about the quantities really only shows up in the first part. The only thing that determines whether you win is your score. And that is entirely, and that is set by this single dimensional sum that you can think of as a single number. And what that implies is that you can analyze the equilibrium of this model in a nested 2-step process. On the outer loop, you have something that looks like a classical first order condition or an envelope condition for an auction that describes the optimal score. Essentially, it says that every bidder type could not benefit by bidding a different score. This is the total sum, the DOT engineers quantities times the unit bid vector, than he sets. But that score is a single number, and the optimality of the score that the bidder chooses is conditional on this inner loop where no matter what score he chooses, the bidder will always try to choose a bid vector that will optimize, that will maximize the certainty equivalent of his profits if he were to win. And it's worth noting that this inner problem looks a lot like a standard portfolio optimization problem that we see in asset pricing. Essentially, you're choosing a vector of weights, bids, that balances the value, the benefits that you get from having higher profits from a higher bid, and the risk that you incur by bidding too heavily or too lightly on any particular item. And it's also worth noting that this portfolio optimization problem really says nothing about the strategic considerations about the probability of winning. As soon as you know the score that you're going to choose, you know how to solve this problem exactly. And in fact, if all of the bids, this is a particular example, if all of the bids are going to be non-zero, strictly positive, that is, you bid something on every item, then it even has this very nice linear form. Okay, so now this might be a good time for a sidebar. Because it turns out that the separation that I just talked about, the separation between the bidding problem where you choose your score, thinking about what the other bidders are going to do, and the portfolio problem where conditional on a score, you choose your optimal vector of bids to maximize the certainty equivalent from completing the project, holds much more generally than what I've described. You could have you don't need to have a model with single dimensional heterogeneity on cost. You could have multi-dimensional cost types, you can have multi-dimensional risk aversion, you can have whatever you want, really. And in fact, you could even consider much more complex problems, problems where on the outside, when you're considering the choice of your optimal score, you also take into account dynamic concerns, capacity constraints, even collusion. And what would still hold is that as long as your inner problem essentially doesn't affect your future decisions, as long as conditional on winning, you still want to maximize the particular project that you're working on right now, you can do the separation. And so the portfolio problem will hold at whatever equilibrium score happens to be right, given the full strategic context. And that's kind of useful because it gives us, it perhaps gives a way to identify bidder types that's different than what is typically done in empirical auction work. The idea there is that if you can solve the bidder's portfolio optimization problem, you can predict what the bid for each item each bidder would have given a particular type, however you characterize this type, and the equilibrium score that you see, that you observe in the data. You can use that to make inferences about the types that best rationalize the bids that you see. And this uses a very different kind of heterogeneity than is typically seen. Really, you're using heterogeneity in the project composition, right? In the composition of the portfolio problem, rather than in the composition of bidders or bidder beliefs about other bidders. And so in some sense, this is agnostic to how the equilibrium score is chosen. You could in principle accommodate a much more complex outer model. But of course, you definitely need a model of the portfolio problem, especially in finite data. And of course, we are in a setting of finite data. And so let me back up to my stylized example and argue that this portfolio problem already gives some useful hints at how to think about the bids that we see in mass auctions. And the point that I want to make in terms of predictions is that you can see from this portfolio optimization problem that if you know the components of these things, if you know essentially how to model bidder beliefs about quantities, that is the expected quantity for each item and the variance, so the level of uncertainty of each item in each auction, then you can see right away that there should be some patterns in the data if the bidders are doing this right. In particular, bidders benefit from having higher bids when there are higher quantities, or in particular, higher relative expected quantities that the bidders believe rather than the DOT. And perhaps most importantly to the risk-averse case, items with higher variance, that is higher values of risk, should have lower bids overall, or lower markups really. There should be a negative relationship between these two. And so let me show you what this looks like in massed out bridge auctions. Just very quickly, I'm going to look at a data set of about 10 years worth of auctions focusing on bridges. That's about 440 of them. I get to see everything about these auctions, really, the entire bid vectors of every bidder that's involved, as well as the quantities ex ante and ex post and some other information. These auctions are not huge, but they're quite big relative to the bidders involved. They're somewhat competitive. The median auction has about 6 bidders, lasts about a year and a half, and costs just under $2 million. And as I mentioned before, the number of items varies, but the typical auction has about 67 items. And I'll emphasize, because my talk is about risk aversion, I'll emphasize the second prediction, that holding everything else fixed, items with higher variance should have lower weight in the portfolio. And the first way to look at that is really taking that directly. So I'll take my absolute value of the variance of profits, the standard deviation of each item, and sorry, the actual markup, and I'll compare that to the standard deviation of each item. And so this is looking really directly for the negative relationship of that second component, the risk component of the portfolio problem. And as you can see, there is a substantial negative relationship. A lot of this line is coming from the fact that items with really low variance have really higher markups. But I think that that should not deter us. That actually makes a lot of sense. And it's very robustly true in the data. Another way to look at this, which might be perhaps more convincing, is rather than looking at just absolute markups, directly matching the term in the portfolio problem, we can look at the proportion of revenue that's coming from each item. And again, this is a bin scatter across items, across auctions, but the pattern is fairly clear. Items with lower variance tend to have higher weight in the portfolio. And so these should give us some reason to believe that these small firms are really behaving like risk-averse agents, at least in the portfolio problem. Okay, so what can we do with this? So let me go back a little bit and talk about how we could do estimation with this. Essentially, the portfolio problem gave us a prediction, but it gave us something much stronger. At least under the stylized assumptions that I made, the portfolio problem tells us exactly what bid each person, each bidder should have submitted for each item, given their equilibrium score. And so the idea of estimation is to use that and to use the heterogeneity across the bids that people actually submitted relative to the model that would be predicted at a particular parameter or set of parameters to try to identify what parameters seem to be true in this data or best rationalize the data. And since I made a number of assumptions, let me go back and be a little bit clear about exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to assume that bidders observe a common noisy signal of each item's quantity. It's going to be this Gaussian model, for example, with Cara. I'm going to assume that bidders have a standard risk-averse preference utility function. I'll mostly talk about Cara, but I can also accommodate CRRA. At least for this talk, I'm going to assume that bidders primarily differ by a private cost multiplier, alpha. I'll talk a little bit about what happens with risk aversion in a bit, but these are sort of the canonical assumptions that I'm going to hold. And the idea of estimation is to do a two-step procedure where first I try to estimate the parameters of the portfolio problem. In particular, I'm going to estimate a statistical model for the item quantities. And what that'll give me is a projection for an expected quantity and a variance term for each item in each auction. I'm going to do this in the best way that I can with a rich hierarchical regression model. And once I have that, I'll be able to solve the portfolio problem for any bidder given a set of parameters, and I'm going to essentially minimize the residual between observed bids from this model. Okay. So what does this look like? Just to show you how this can work across different models, here I've just replicated the solution to the portfolio problem in terms of the parameters that I'm interested in. I'm interested in a cost parameter alpha and a Cara coefficient gamma. And since all of the bids that I observe in my data are strictly positive, I can just use this linear form, which is quite nice. And in fact, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you could do almost the same thing with CRRA. And here you have perhaps a slightly more degrees of freedom. You have a wealth parameter that you can try to estimate, but it doesn't look that different. And as I mentioned, the way that the primary strategy for estimation is going to be essentially to minimize the residual between the observed bids for every bidder in my data and the bids that would be predicted by my model at each parameter set. And you can think of this as GMM. You can think about it as just error minimization, but the main idea that's important here is that the kinds of variation that are really important here are a variation in the composition of the items in the portfolio of each project. The items that are involved, they're going to be a little bit different each time, and some portfolios or some projects are also going to require more items that are sort of easy to predict, and so they're very typically skewed. There's also going to be heterogeneity across the particular project features, so the project manager or designer, for example, as well as the composition of the bidders that were involved, who might all impact, who of course impact their own cost types. Okay, and since I emphasized that this is a fairly general framework, it's worth emphasizing that I've tried a couple of different versions of this, and so I've tried CARA and CRRA, and for estimation I can support a fair amount of heterogeneity in how I think about risk aversion. So throughout the talk up till now, I've really focused on having a single common CARA coefficient for all of the bidders, at least within an auction. That could be common across all auctions. It could be common across within an auction. In fact, we could also have big and small bidders if we think that that's relevant, or even individual specific types that are completely two-dimensional. It's worth mentioning that having this level of heterogeneity, having multi-dimensional types is quite difficult, and trying to predict the actual equilibrium or construct equilibria with multi-dimensional bidder types is often an intractable problem. But none of that is a challenge here for estimation, because we're really only using the portfolio optimization problem, and that we can solve pretty easily in all of these cases. And so here's an example of what these estimates might look like. These are the estimates for a model in which you have a single CARA coefficient across all auctions. And the estimate that we get is 0.046. You can think about that as having a certainty equivalent of about negative $23 for a 50-50 bet for $1,000. Of course, that scales very badly because it's CARA. And a median cost efficiency type of about 0.95, which is to say that the median bidder is about 5% more efficient than the government would have predicted based on market rates. But there are a couple of different models, and so to give you a sense of how they compare, here I've plotted the gamma estimates, the CARA coefficient estimates, in the percentile, 10 to 90th percentiles for each of my specifications. Here I have one type across all auctions, and so that's the 0.046. If you have different gammas in each auction, you have a bit of a spread with a big focus of lower CARA coefficients, which might explain why the estimate is a bit large. And if you allow for example, having big bidders and small bidders, this is on top of the project specific types, you now have a couple of larger gamma estimates that you have to rationalize. And if you allow complete flexibility, then you start seeing a bigger spread. What that means it would require a bit of a longer discussion, but at least here you see what the lay of the land is. Okay. Similarly, I showed you some alpha coefficients. So these are across the winners of all of the auctions. And here I have the same percentiles as before. This is the common type. If you have a single CARA coefficient for all of the projects, similarly to the previous graph, here you have a different CARA coefficient per project, big and small bidders, and everyone can have their own CARA coefficient as they might fall out, as best rationalized as their own portfolio choice. As you can see, the spread is not very different. We predict very similar cost types across the board. But there are a few differences. For example, our model would predict that having a higher cost type might be correlated with having a higher level of risk aversion. And so perhaps that's what we're seeing in some sense. There are multiple ways to explain a similar pattern if you allow enough specificity. Okay, so what does this all mean? So I mentioned a couple of different policy designs that we might think of for this setting. The way that I'm going to evaluate them is I'm essentially going to construct a counterfactual auction. I'm going to take my estimates of alpha types of cost types and my estimate of the CAR coefficient for each auction, however I might have done this. And I'm going to focus on the case in which I have still single dimensional heterogeneity across the bidders within an auction for expositional purposes at the very least. And I'm going to essentially model what the problem of a representative bidder for this project, for each project would be for every potential type of alpha. I'm going to then compute what would happen in expectation for the DOT, in particular at the winning bidder, given the distribution of the winning bids. What is the amount that the DOT would pay in expectation? And there are a couple of different, this is going back to my earlier slide, there are a couple of different policies that you might think. The first policy is that you might try to just reduce uncertainty. So you can think about this as investing in an engineer who then goes and does a much better job of speccing out what's going to be necessary. Let's say in the best possible case scenario, the bidders make no mistakes and the engineer can reduce uncertainty to 0. In that case, the DOT would save about 12% on median. So that's you can think of that as an upper bound on how much this investment could be worth. You can also try to, I mentioned this isn't really counterfactual, but you might think that the scaling auction is not doing very much for you. And so you might think that this insurance is not worth much. You go back to a lump sum auction in which you ask the bidders to just submit a single number at the time of bidding. You don't have this payment for ex post quantities. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that would cost more. A way to read this is that using a scaling auction in the first place is already saving the government about 85% for the median auction, so quite a lot. You might also try to subsidize entry costs. The idea there is that there's uncertainty that bidders face in just participating in the auction. If they're risk averse, you might be able to subsidize that and encourage more bidders to participate. So adding an additional bidder, just if you were able to lop them on for free, would save you about 5 2/3% for the median auction. But in terms of if you actually estimate the entry costs, if you were to just give them as free money to everybody who participates, that would only cost you about 1% of the expected cost for a particular auction. And so this could really be worthwhile. And it's worth mentioning that subsidizing entry costs, again, really only works for risk-averse bidders. You could show robustly that if bidders are risk neutral, there'd be no value to that. And finally, you might try to do something about the portfolio problem itself. For example, you might impose some caps on the level of risk that bidders take. You might say you can't bid any less than 25% of the market rate, or you might go in the other direction and say you can't bid too high in a particular item. And even that would save you a little bit of money. It would save you about 1 2/3% for the median auction. All of which is to say, the policy toolkit here is quite large, and all of these policies have been considered by the DOT to various degrees. These counterfactuals are all computed using the simplest version of my model, but they're already producing a fairly good idea of how these policies might compare and how you might do a broader analysis. So with that, I don't want to dig into Brad's time. Thank you very much. Take questions, anything.
Thank you very much, Shoshana, for that talk. That I found it very interesting. We didn't see any questions here on the blog, but I have a couple of questions that came up as I listened to your presentation. So I was impressed by the kind of courageous choice of model that you made, right? One-dimensional private values, but risk aversion. It seems very tractable, but how do you make that choice, or how do you justify that? It could be multidimensional types, or it could be interdependent values, which is kind of the sort of runner-up or kind of the next obvious choice of models.
That's a good question. So there's one version of that is how do you think about where multidimensionality should exist? And I think the best argument that I have is that if you focus on cost types where you might think there's multidimensionality, it actually makes sense in the context of these kinds of auctions to think of cost as being multiplicative, right? Most of the items here are commodities. We know what the price of concrete is. You can just go out and find what the list price is. And so you have to explain why these bidders should be different. From my conversations with the DOT, just on an institutional basis, it seems to make sense that a lot of what makes them different really scales across the whole project. And so that kind of makes sense. Now, that doesn't tell you why you couldn't have multidimensional types in the sense of having heterogeneous Cara coefficients, for example, or something like that. And to your sort of broader point, I tried to emphasize that I make my heroic choice of model for counterfactuals to focus on, to try to show what risk aversion might be doing in this context. But I don't actually use any of that in estimation. And so in fact, I could support multidimensional Cara coefficients, heterogeneous Cara coefficients, and I do a version of that. I can probably even support more if I knew how to model a portfolio problem. And I'm not ruling out interdependent types or really anything else when I'm doing this estimation. But I made it for, at least for expositional purposes, for making the point that that mechanism design could be affected. I sort of chose the simplest model that seems to explain the data reasonably well.
Okay, which means you didn't touch on the question about interdependent values or common values.
Oh, sorry, yes. Yes, right, sorry. There's no really good answer there, to be totally honest. I thought that my understanding was that interdependent values would be sort of a secondary concern when thinking about risk. But I guess the most honest answer is that this would add additional complexity, and so I didn't really touch upon it.
Okay, well, maybe it's almost philosophical, the approach, right? Either you put the burden on risk aversion or you put it on interdependent values.
Yeah, exactly. This is not to say that so it's something I haven't really thought very much about. So I haven't looked at tests for whether this is for whether types seem likely to be interdependent, for example. So unfortunately, I don't have a more satisfying answer to that at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, great. Just one quick question. If you were to choose the efficient auction, what would that be? Right. I mean, in a sense, you didn't really touch on the design about the auction. Like you didn't say, oh,
auction, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think at least if you buy my model for Cara, for example, I think this would work without Cara as well. We know what the optimal auction would look like. Maskin and Riley sort of spell it out. And so what we'd want to do is get to Maskin and Riley as soon as possible. So Maskin and Riley it tells you how to construct the optimal auction with risk-averse bidders when you're bidding over a single value object. The idea is you essentially have two sets of tariffs. You have everybody pay a little bit, or I guess be paid a little bit in this case, to participate. And then there's a secondary sort of a scaling translation of how that converts to actual payments after the winner is determined. And that's optimal in the sense that it sort of maximally incentivizes the best bidders from the auctioneer's perspective to bid. So that much is known. And so the only question is, how do you get to Maskin and Riley? If we're already in Maskin and Riley land, where we can do whatever kind of auction design that we want, the easiest way to do it is to essentially require bidders to report their beliefs, punish them infinitely if they, or just reject them automatically if they disagree. And then as soon as you know their beliefs, you can project what the solution to their portfolio problem would be for each type. And so then you can essentially simulate Maskin and Riley land. That was kind of brief, but hopefully it gives the idea. Yeah.
Okay. There's one question that we have from the panel. Do you want to read it, or? So
yeah. So the question is, how do you expect the results in bridges to translate to other types of public work, such as road pavement? So that's a good question. So I chose bridges because bridges have a lot of uncertainty. Road pavement is a bit more stable and easier to predict. And so it seemed like a worse setting for focusing a lot on the portfolio problem. So the most basic conclusion of my paper, I think, is if you just look at what scaling auctions are doing relative to lump sum auctions. And this is something that's been thought about in policy. I think some departments of transportation, like Florida, I think, have an explicit discussion of this in their guidebook, where they say they let the managers choose whether to do a scaling auction or a lump sum auction. And the language that they use is about standardization, essentially. Very standardized auctions can be scaled. And whereas more complex auctions, where you might think that, say, moral hazard is at play, should be done with lump sum. I would add to that something about the level of uncertainty, but I guess the most basic answer would be that I'd expect road pavement to have less uncertainty, and so risk aversion is perhaps less relevant to begin with. But I can definitely imagine other public works in which there's a lot of uncertainty, in which case this is quite applies quite directly.
Okay, thanks. That was a very neat segue into the next presentation by Brad on mechanism design with estimation. Thank you very much, Shoshana. And Brad is up next. Here he is. And his co-author, Anthony Lee Zhang, is there as well, and happy to take questions on the go. Please go ahead, Brad.
All right, thanks. So yeah, this is joint work with Anthony Zhang, who's also a panelist here on the call. So feel free to ask questions during the presentation via the Q&A there at the bottom, and Anthony will respond to them. If they're really hard, then my kids are in the next room, and they'll take the really hard questions. So this paper differs from Shoshana's in that we're describing it as a methodology paper, whereas I think Shoshana could also have really gone off on the methodology she has there. Looks really awesome. It has great implications for other auction literature, other auction settings. It seems like to me this portfolio case. So we're going to describe an approach we think could also be used in various auctions, but also especially in bargaining, and where we have less theoretical results, incomplete information bargaining, where we could use definitely no off-the-shelf tools. So there's this growing empirical literature studying auctions and bargaining and matching, and auctions especially have been around as in the literature for 25 years here. So frequent goal of this literature is to compare welfare measures from some mechanism used in the data to some counterfactual theoretical benchmark that achieves efficiency or optimality or equity or something we care about. And the key object we need in order to estimate these counterfactuals is we need distributions of players' valuations. And so those are the key primitives we need to estimate. And the usual approach in the literature is to use some knowledge of the rules of the game or the extensive form of the game they're playing to write down some equilibrium first order condition or some other equilibrium relationship, and then invert this to learn what the distribution of values must have been. So the seminal example of this would be Geerpring and Wang, their non-parametric identification argument for first price auctions. And we're going to describe how I'm going to describe today how what we propose, what Anthony and I are doing, is it can be thought of as a generalization of GPV to other games where you might not know the rules of the game. So with many games, they aren't as simple and as a first price auction and don't have a simple analytical solution. So alternating offer bargaining is one example. And when I say alternating offer bargaining, I imagine that for many of you, the first thing that comes to mind is you think, oh, well, Rubinstein's model already solved that. Rubinstein's model is complete information. It's where both parties know each other's valuation perfectly. And yes, there is a single or a unique subgame perfect equilibrium to that, but we're talking about Bayes-Nash equilibria here, where both parties have private information, and it turns out that the literature does not have a great solution to handling a continuum of valuations like we think about in IO, and both parties getting to make offers. There's no characterization of the continuum, the multiplicity of equilibria that exist in that kind of game, or a median or a mean price auction. These are also complicated. We don't have standard approaches for these auctions with collusion or other kind of multi-stage games like an auction followed by bargaining. Then there's belief updating that happens in between the different stages of the game, and that can really complicate the identification or estimation. So the theory literature on mechanism design, it handles kind of complicated games like this using the revelation principle. So where they study the direct mechanism where players report true value to the mechanism designer, who then makes the allocations and the transfers in the game happen just as they would have in the original game. And what we're going to argue here in this paper is that this kind of approach can also be applied to the empirical analysis of incomplete information trading games. So even though we can't, even in games where we can't analytically characterize the equilibrium, the direct mechanism is essentially identified in the data, and this leads to identification of the player's value distributions, as we'll show. And the theory results we're gonna exploit here, they're known. We're just essentially using revealed preferences. So you could say it's also just known in the empirical work. But what we're going to describe today is not the standard approach for handling incomplete information trading games in particular. But we're not proposing that we are the first to come up with revealed preferences as an identification estimation approach, for example. So we're going to provide some simple identification estimation arguments that are robust to the econometrician not knowing the rules of the game that the players were playing. And I'll describe why that's particularly important. And inability to also the inability of the researcher to analytically characterize the equilibrium, or potentially the existence of multiple equilibria. This is related to a large literature on trading games. So there's certainly the mechanism design literature with Meyerson and Satterthwaite looking at Meyerson looking at auctions, Meyerson Satterthwaite looking at bilateral bargaining, and Williams who extended that to extend the Meyerson Satterthwaite argument, and then Simon and Leslie's our organizers here, their recent work kind of extends some of this in a theoretical framework to think about mergers and other competition policy issues of how to use this incomplete information bargaining mechanism design kind of framework. And the empirical auction literature also follows this same tradition where they think about incomplete information. So they allow for there to be incomplete information here. Klein has a recent paper that's very related to what we look at today in our paper. But there's a lot of settings where we don't have monotone equilibria and we have less work there, less empirical work on that kind of a setting. And our approach could apply there to that kind of an auction. But even though auctions have allowed for this sort of private information, bargaining, we really don't have a lot of empirical work on bargaining with incomplete information, in part because it's so tricky to model. We don't have great equilibrium results that we can easily map outcomes to valuations, primitives that must have generated them. The existing bargain literature, like Crawford and Yokoglu, for example, and many that build on it, they focus on non-strategic, complete information bargaining settings. So they think of bargaining as just as Nash bargaining, where there's no actual private information between the bargaining parties. And this is awesome because of the progress they can make with these Nash and Nash models, studying oligopoly and bargaining in bigger problems, in different problems than we tackle today. But if they wanted to allow for private information in there, there's no off-the-shelf tool. There's no great way to do that. And we're going to try to propose a tool that at least gets partway in that direction, but it's still not yet for prime time able to incorporate all the demand and supply pieces that might be embedded in something like some of these complicated vertical relationship models. So I want to mention this too, that this applies to this broader research agenda that I have, and Anthony and I and other co-authors are working on incomplete information bargaining empirical work. So there's a large theory literature on incomplete information bargaining, but they tend to focus on particular equilibria. So like in the Perry paper or Crampton paper, there's no full characterization of equilibria of these games because of off-equilibrium beliefs. They just lead to many equilibria, and existing refinements like sequential equilibria, perfect Bayes Nash, they don't really narrow the scope. They don't really help us out the way they're intended to when it comes to a sequential bargaining game. And so our goal in this broader agenda here is to try to learn all we can from real world bargaining data without imposing assumptions that are really strong about the structure of the game. So some existing work that relates to what we're doing today is Dan Keniston, Silveira, and Ambrose et al., and also reduced form work by Grennan and Swanson, and David's paper from yesterday, right here, he's looking at the Australian electricity market, is trying to learn what they can from real world settings that can help inform some of this theory. And then here's the number of papers we're working on in used cars and data from eBay, and some mediators and business-to-business negotiations for used cars. And then this new paper that's still in progress here, we're trying to look at negotiations in auto injury claims and housing, international trade, and trying to gather all these alternating offer bargaining settings we can from a broad variety of data settings. I want to point out that these two papers here from these two sub-bullets, the used car bargaining and also this eBay data, these are huge data sets that we've made publicly available. You can find those on my website. This one has over 250,000 observations of these used car transactions, and this has over 25 million full back and forth sequences on eBay. And we encourage you to share these with your students and co-authors, and we think these would be great opportunities for studying, getting insights about real world bargaining. And we'd love to talk about them offline as well. So in this paper today, we're going to suppose that the econometrician observes many instances of a game, and for each game, the econometrician observes the allocation. So who got what, how did the game end, the transfer that happened at the end of the game, and either something about the player's action or some proxy for the player's type. And I'll come back to this more later. So just think of it as though the econometrician observes the player's actions. So in an example, in a first price auction example, allocation would mean you know who the winner is, you know how much the final price was, and you know the player's bid. You know those three things. Those are the only three things you need for our estimation approach here. And there's going to be a lot of games where you do know the rules of the game, like a first price auction. You as the econometrician know that that's what generated the data. But if you have negotiated prices, then you might see whether they traded or not, and you might see the final transfer, but you're not going to know all the rules. You're not going to know exactly what the protocol was that they were following. You just might see these final objects, the final allocation and the final transfer. We're going to argue if you see at least one more thing about an action of the player in the game, that's enough. Even if you don't know the whole protocol they were following in the bargaining game, that'll be enough to help identify the distribution of valuations, as long as it satisfies certain properties that I'll describe here later on. So our two-step identification argument is we're gonna write down a menu that maps actions to expected outcomes, and then valuations are simply derivatives or subgradients in the discrete case of this menu. And I'll show some simulations with first price auctions, and then our application looks at estimating seller valuations in this complicated game of a secret reserve price followed by alternating offer bargaining. And this is going to allow us to speak to the idea of bargaining power in incomplete information settings, which is not typically analyzed in the literature, and also how competition is going to affect the surplus split between the buyers and the sellers here, and the efficiency in this incomplete information bargaining setting. So the model we have in mind, we're thinking of players with independent private values, and we can generalize our results to some of our results to correlated private value settings, but I'm going to skip that for the sake of time. The econometrician is going to observe many independent instances of the same game. There's going to be M agents, and they all have a private valuation drawn from this distribution FV. And we can allow for asymmetry for them all to have distinct distributions. This is just for simplification. We're going to assume that they come from the same distribution here. If we have buyers and sellers in a bargaining game, we'll definitely think of buyers as drawing from a different distribution than sellers, as we do in our application. Agents are going to choose an action, little a, which is going to determine the allocation. So the agent I's allocation is X, and that's going to be a function of all the other agents' actions. And agent I's transfer is going to be a function of all the other agents' actions. So these objects or these functions are what we're going to think of as kind of the rules of the game. This is what, if I take this action and everybody else takes these actions, will I win? And if I take these actions, how much will I pay? And these are the things that are easily known, and that are obviously known if you know the data comes from a first price auction, for example. But you don't really know this if you just see that players negotiated, but you don't know what all happened in the negotiations. You don't know all the actions that took place during the negotiations. Those are cases where you don't really know the rules of the game. And that's typically what in bargaining settings, people would then move to say, well, I'm just going to assume it was Nash bargaining, complete information Nash bargaining. Nobody had any private values because otherwise I can't do anything. And we're going to say here, well, there is something you might be able to do, even in negotiated price settings. So in equilibrium, the action that agent I takes, AI, is going to lead to some expected outcome. This is the expected allocation. You can think of this as the expected probability of winning, where the expectation is taken over all the other agents' actions, and some expected transfer. So this is the expected transfer that agent I is going to pay, taking expectation over all other agents' actions. Player I is going to take action AI if the following incentive compatibility inequality is satisfied, or you could just call this the definition of a Nash equilibrium here, Bayes Nash equilibrium here, that your value times the probability of winning minus your transfer under the action you do take must be higher than it would be under any other action. And we can rearrange this inequality here to put VI to put bounds on VI. So for an agent that chose action AI, it must be the case that their value is higher than this ratio for any action that would have given them a lower probability of trade, and their value must be lower than this ratio for any action that would have given them a higher probability of trade. So I'm going to illustrate this with a little figure here where we have a game with 5 possible actions. So there's action 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On the horizontal axis is the probability that agent I wins given the action, and on the vertical axis is the expected transfer of agent I given the action that agent I takes. And in this game, then the indifference curves are just straight lines here because this payoff is just linear in the player's value. So moving to the southeast here to move down and to the right, these are higher utility indifference curves. And we're going to think about an agent who picked action 3. So an agent who picked action 3 could have picked any of the other actions. And by picking action 3, the agent has revealed here that even though I could have had a lower transfer by picking action, I could have paid less by picking action 2 or action 1. I picked this one, and so it must have been worth it to do so. We can take the highest subgradient of this menu here for actions with a lower probability of trade than 3, and that's going to yield a lower bound on the player's value. We can do the same thing for actions that would have been more likely to, the agent would have been more likely to win under these higher bids. You could think of it as an auction or whatever it may be, whatever this action represents. The lowest subgradient of these different actions the agent could have chosen instead is going to be an upper bound on the player's value. So together we have the slope of the menu at the point that the agent picked is going to help determine the agent's value. And to any theorists out there, you think, well, of course, this is obvious. We already know this. What I'm going to point out here is that we can use this as an identification result without having to know the rules of the game they were playing, just only being able to estimate the expected transfer and expected probability given the agent's actions. So one thing to point out is that any actions on the interior of this menu should obviously not be chosen by the agent, because the agent can get to a higher indifference curve choosing any action that's actually on the menu. So like this 0.6 should not be chosen by anyone. The menu of these, this PT menu or described here is going to be a convex menu. And again, as I described, the agent's value is bounded by this set of subgradients between the at the point that the agent does pick. So our identification argument is pretty simple then. We're just saying for multiple independent repetitions of the game, the econometrician observes the allocations in a given instance of the game, the transfer, and the action that got picked. And again, I'll describe a generalized version of this action idea, but suppose it's just they observe the bids in the game. Then the two-step identification argument is simply that the PT menu is observed in the data, essentially. It's just simply the means of the allocations and the transfers conditional on the actions. So you can just, this is easy to estimate. We'll describe estimation in a moment here, but it's just the expected allocation given your action and the expected transfer given your action. And then the values are simply going to be the subgradients of this menu. And with continuous actions, which is where we see the most likely use case for this for empirical work, the continuous actions case, then the subgradients are simply ratios of the derivatives. So it's just the ratio of the derivative of the expected transfer function over the expected allocation function, or you could just think of it as the derivative itself of this menu. So which again should be obvious. We're just moving the indifference curves and saying you choose the point or tangent, as we know in many economic settings. But here's some notes on the identification then. So this doesn't require the econometrician to know the rules of the game. So you could, as long as you see the allocations and the transfers and some action taken by the players, you can we can estimate the. So for example, in a negotiation setting, there's going to be some negotiation settings at least where we're going to apply this result without even knowing whether it was an alternating offer bargaining game, or knowing whether it was a take it or leave it offer bargaining game, or knowing whether it was a K double auction or whatever rule for the bargaining they were using. We don't need to know that. The reason that's important too is because even if we did know the rules in a bargaining game, there are multiple equilibria. It wouldn't really help a whole lot. We'd have no idea that we don't have unique equilibrium results like we have often in many first price auction settings, for example. So this does require, however, assuming that the same equilibrium is played in all realizations we have in the data, which is very common in the structural work. We're not going to have to assume that the equilibrium is unique. We can allow there to be many equilibria in the game they're playing, and we don't have to be able to solve for what equilibrium they are playing, but we have to assume that of the many equilibria that are possible, the data we see, the realized data, comes from just one. To estimate values for a given agent, another thing to point out here is that we only have to assume that that agent has correct beliefs about opponent actions. We don't have to assume that the opponent's actions themselves are rational even. So if, for example, in a bargaining setting, you want to estimate the buyer's valuations, and you think it's unreasonable in this setting to think of the sellers as being rational. Maybe the buyer is a professional and the seller is an individual, doesn't bargain as much, not a professional. Then if all you care about is one party's valuations, you don't need to assume the other party is behaving rationally. You just need to assume that the buyer has correct beliefs about how this irrational agent is going to behave. All right, so for estimation, we propose a couple of different approaches. One, the first here is local quadratic regression. We're just going to say for each game, the econometrician again observes the allocation, so who won in a bargaining game or in an auction, the transfers, and the actions, some action the player took, and then we can just estimate this as a conditional expectation given the action that was taken, and estimate the expected transfer function as a conditional expectation given the action that was taken. And the reason we like local quadratic here is because if you include this local quadratic term, then the coefficient on the slope term there is going to give you a consistent estimate of the derivative of t and the derivative of p, and you can take the ratio of those two, and that will give you an estimate of players' valuations. An alternative that would take advantage of the convexity of the menu, that theoretically this should be convex, is you could estimate p as a spline function and then t as a spline function of p, and there are various monotone constrained splines we could apply, or a convexity constrained spline we could apply for estimation of this t of p menu. And constraining the menu to be convex in this fashion is equivalent to ironing the mechanism, as in the theory literature in Meyerson and many that have followed. So let me give an example here with first price auctions to illustrate what we're thinking about. So for first price auctions, GPV showed that you can think of the value of a bidder as being that you can rewrite the first order condition for the bid action AI here so that you have the value of the valuation that generated that bid is going to be equal to the agent's bid plus this ratio of the CDF of the bids and the density of the bids. And this is directly exploiting this known equilibrium first order condition for a first price auction, and they just estimate these pieces, getting the empirical CDF of bids and the empirical density of bids, and that gives them an estimate of V hat, the bidder's value who must have bid that amount, A, and also then the distribution of bids. But we could use this menu approach instead. We could tie our hands here and say, let's pretend we don't know that data comes from a first price auction. Can we still estimate valuations? And yes, we can. We can just take the expected transfer. We can estimate that in the data and take the expected probability of winning and take the ratio of those two derivatives, and that's going to give us an estimate of V. It's essentially, we're taking the numerical derivative here of this menu. And it doesn't exploit any knowledge of the rules of the game or the ability of the econometrician to solve analytically for the equilibrium or to prove the equilibrium is unique. And it turns out that what we're doing here is equivalent to GPV's identification argument. So if in a first price auction, then we know the functional form essentially of the probability you win as a function of the distribution of bids. It's going to be G to the m-1, and the transfer is going to be the amount you bid times the probability you win. That's the expected transfer. And if you take the derivatives of these two objects, then we just end up with this same formula. So our approach is saying, well, let's just jump straight to these derivatives and estimate these derivatives instead of exploiting knowledge of the rules of the game. And you might say, why would I ever want to do that? And the answer is you wouldn't in a first price auction. If you know you have first price auction data, then exploit it and you'll get better results than us. But if you don't know the rules of the game, like if it's a bargaining game, for example, an incomplete information bargaining game, you don't know what they're playing, then that's where our results are going to be powerful. And we show this here with the first price auction, that you should use GPV, not us, if you know it's a first price auction. So here we did some simulations. The black line that you can't even see is the truth. And the reason you can't see it is because GPV does so awesome that it covers up. GPV is the blue line, and they just cover up it just hits it exactly. But we don't do too bad either. So the red line is our local quadratic estimate, and the green line is our spline estimate. And our estimates are certainly noisier. Those are 95% confidence intervals, the dashed lines. But our point estimates aren't too far off. And what we're estimating here is the bid on the x-axis and the corresponding estimate of the valuation on the y-axis. So these red and green lines, we estimated these without tying our hands here, and without assuming it was a first price auction at all, and we don't do too shabby, we think. So in a lot of multi-round games, though, it's not going to be as easy knowing what the action is. What is the bid that we're thinking about here? So that would, really observing all the actions in like an alternating offer bargaining game would mean you'd have to observe essentially this whole list of contingent actions that an agent would use if they were going to bid on your behalf. And you're never going to actually see that kind of thing in the data. So what we're going to propose is that you'll often have some kind of variable, we're just calling Z here, that satisfies conditions similar to what an instrumental variable has to satisfy. It's going to satisfy some sort of exclusion, meaning it's that for agent I's Z is not related to the other agent's values, and also some kind of relevance here. The agent I's Z here is not related to, or is related to, is not orthogonal to agent I's value. With this object, and I'll describe some examples of what we mean by this Z. You can estimate the menu, these same objects P and T as a function of Z, instead of the full action, the full sequence of contingent actions. And derivatives of this menu will still yield true values if Z is 1-to-1 with B. And otherwise, it's gonna yield some kind of estimate of a conditional expectation of the values given Z. And let me give you some examples of where we think this might be a reasonable approach. So in some cases, you might have a Z from the game structure. So the first offer in a multi-stage bargaining game, that we can think of that as ZI for the player who moves first. It depends on that player's value. The first offer is going to depend on the first mover, but it's not going to depend on the other player's private value because the other player hasn't moved yet, and so there's been no belief updating on the part of the first mover. So the first offer could be used, or maybe the bid in a cartel's knockout auction prior to the target auction is another example, or the indicative bid placed in a multi-stage auction, or the reserve price in an auction could be the seller's reserve price. Could help you identify seller valuations without knowing the full, without solving for the full equilibrium of the game. But you can also get these from institutional background sometimes. So an example of this would be demographics or characteristics of player I that might be known to the researchers but unobserved to other players, like things in the data that we see in settings that we have, that I've worked with sometimes, where we can see things about the income or the previous inventory holdings of the player. The econometrician often has some of this stuff in the data, or maybe information about player I that's more generally that's unknown to other players. So an example of this that I really like is Ambrose, Cheney, and Solitsky had this great paper on bargaining of pirate hostages. North African pirates came and took Spaniards back to Africa and bargained with them. And they see in the data this private information of the Spanish bargainers. That's the amount of earmarked money raised by the hostages' family back home, back in the hometown in Valencia or wherever it was in Spain. And this is something that the econometrician could use, for example, to estimate this menu without knowing the whole protocol of the game. So the econometrician in this case would see, did they agree to trade or not? What was the final price they agreed to trade at? And what was the earmarked money? This is the Z that they need here. And those three pieces are all we need for our estimation approach. So here's our empirical application. We're going to look at wholesale used auto auctions. So this is a very large industry where used car dealers buy cars from other dealers and also from large fleet and lease companies. So they'll buy them from and manufacturers as well. Ford's buyback plan, they'll come sell their cars through here, or you'll have Bank of America selling repossessed vehicles or off-lease vehicles, or Hertz rental car companies selling their cars. It's a big industry. Over 300 auction houses nationwide in the US, and annually runs about 15 million cars through the lanes, totaling $83 billion in sales. And this is used outside of the US as well. This is kind of the backbone of the supply side of the used car industry throughout the world in many countries here. So the way it works in many of these auctions is the seller will bring the vehicle to the auction house and report a secret reserve price, and the buyers can inspect the vehicles. And then these cars are driven through these lanes here, and inside you have the bidders standing around, and the bidders again are used car dealers. They're professionals here. This is a business-to-business transaction, and there's an auctioneer standing up here. The auctioneer calls out prices and continues to raise them until only one bidder is left. And if the high bidder, if the auction price there exceeds the reserve price, then the high bidder gets the car. Otherwise, it goes into this alternating offer bargaining game, and that's what complicates stuff. If it weren't for this alternating offer bargaining game, this would be a traditional empirical auctions paper. We could study it really easily. It's this alternating offer bargaining between two players with private values that really complicates this game here. So here's the timing of the game then. The seller picks a secret reserve price. We're going to note that R as a function of the seller's type, seller's private valuation, VS. And the buyer has a private value, VB. Each of them, I should have said VB sub I. Each buyer in the auction has a private value, VBI. They bid in this ascending auction, and we're going to call the auction price PA. If PA is less than R, the reserve price, then that's when bargaining can happen, but the buyer is allowed to opt out of the bargaining. That's one piece that, that's unique about this setting. If the buyer doesn't opt out, then the seller gets to choose, I'm either going to accept the auction price, make a counteroffer, or quit. And if the seller makes a counteroffer, it then goes to the buyer, and the buyer gets to accept the next counteroffer, or make or quit, or make a new counteroffer. And all this back and forth bargaining continues until one party accepts or quits. And the whole thing is intermediated over the phone here by the auction house, by an employee. So there's off-the-shelf tools for estimating FB. We really want to know FB right here and FS. There's off-the-shelf tools for getting FB. We can just use auction prices to invert and get FB, but there's no existing method to get FS. That's the really complicated piece here. And there's no analytical solution or equilibrium first order condition here we can invert because of this two-sided incomplete information bargaining that's happening after the auction. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply this menu approach. So we're going to estimate seller valuations as derivatives of the menu defined by seller's choices of the secret reserve price. So the secret reserve price here is what's functioning as our Z, this ZI that I described before, to help us estimate seller's values. It's something that the seller, we know this depends on the seller's valuation. It isn't the seller's true valuation, but it depends on it, and it's not known to the buyers. And it happens at the beginning of the game before any of the rest of the complicated back and forth updating might happen. So the big assumptions we're going to have to make here, though, is we're going to assume that seller and buyer valuations are independent, which is an assumption we're using throughout the presentation here today. We have conditional IPV. We are going to allow for some game level heterogeneity in the cars and the kind of things they're bargaining over. All observations are generated by the same equilibrium. That's one of our big assumptions. We're going to assume that the secret reserve price is strictly increasing in the seller's value. And that's what's gonna make it so we can use derivatives of the menu implied by the secret reserve price as our estimates of the seller's valuation. And we're also gonna assume that game actions here are additively separable in the game level heterogeneity that I'll describe in a second here. So here's what we observe. We observe 130,000 observations of this game. It's about 6 auction houses over a 3-year period. For each instance of the game, we see the reserve price, an indicator for whether trade occurs, and the final transfer. These are the 3 pieces we really need to use our approach. But we also observe that they're going to be useful here for allowing for heterogeneity. We also observe the auction price and a large vector of game level characteristics that I'm going to call YJ. We're going to assume that in game J, the seller's value is this private component plus this heterogeneity component that's going to be that's going to just shift up or down the total valuation for the car. So this right here is observable heterogeneity. And this right here, W, is unobserved heterogeneity, things that the sellers and buyers see about the car that I, as the econometrician, cannot see. So things like, is the car smoked in, or is there a big dent on the side? And the buyer's value, we're going to assume, is also shifted up by this same Y prime gamma plus W. So this is the observable heterogeneity that they all see, and I can see too. And again, the observable heterogeneity the heterogeneity that they can see that I can't. And then this is the buyer's private valuation. And our assumption we're going to assume here is that about heterogeneity that I mentioned on the last slide is that in game J, the reserve prices, auction prices, and final transfers, these continuous actions in the game, they're all additively separable in this heterogeneity, so that I can just get rid of it the way traditional auction models would get rid of it. And I'll describe how you do that here. So we regress the auction prices and the reserve prices on observable characteristics. This is analogous to the bid homogenization step that Hale, Hong, and Shum provide, and their more recent paper with Jorge Balat. Residuals from this regression then are going to give us an estimate of this convoluted object that still has the unobserved heterogeneity in it. So it's the reserve prices plus the unobserved heterogeneity and the auction price plus unobserved heterogeneity. And then we can write down the likelihood of these R tilde and P tilde objects, the ones that still have W embedded in them, and we can use maximum likelihood and the fact that these individual components are independent to estimate the distributions of W, the auction prices, and the reserve price. And the reason this is going to be useful is especially because this gives us the distribution of unobserved heterogeneity, because we're going to be able to use that to deconvolve some other objects here in a second. So steps 1 and 2 here are just kind of traditional auction steps. This is used throughout the literature now in many different settings. 3, 4, 5 are where we're saying we're departing from the literature and saying, all right, now we're getting to the structure of the auction game, and we're going to, the structure of this bargaining game here, this complex auction plus bargaining game. And we're going to say, we don't really know the equilibrium of this game. We can't write down a first order condition to invert here. So instead, we're going to use this menu. We're going to estimate the expected allocation as a function of these objects, these residuals, and the expected transfer as a function of these residuals. And then we can use a deconvolution here to get the true menu, the correct menu, by sort of parsing out now that we know this, we've also identified this distribution FW of unobserved heterogeneity, we can kind of get rid of that and get the correct menu. And then we can simply estimate the distribution of seller valuations as the distribution of those values that are implied by the derivatives of this menu. So I'm going to show what the results look like, but before I show them, let me just briefly describe that this menu is a little bit tricky to think about in some cases, because the one I showed at the beginning, that illustration with 5 actions, that was more like a buyer. You think about it more like a buyer menu I was showing there, where the P is the probability of the buyer getting the good and T is the expected transfer the buyer has to pay. But here instead we've got a seller. So it's a seller picking action R. R is the reserve price, and the seller is going to get VS when the seller keeps the car. So P is the probability not of a buyer winning it. Now it's the probability of a seller keeping the good, and T is essentially going to be the negation of what the seller gets paid. So let me show some illustration here of the menu. This is our estimated menu. These points A, B, C, D. I'm going to talk through them to illustrate it a little bit. So each point on the menu represents some expected outcome as a function of a given reserve price. So this is a different reserve price than this, and then this. They all yield a different PT. And the reason it can be negatively sloped in some places and positively sloped in others is because of this heterogeneity that's additively separable. So your valuation essentially sellers can have negative values here. That just means that if the observable heterogeneity value of the car is $10,000 and the seller has a value of negative 1,000, that means that the seller's value for the car is $1,000 less than sort of the market value for the car, the commonly held value for the car. So we can have negative values, that's negatively sloped parts, and positive values, that's positively sloped parts. We could have shifted this to centered around, not around 0 instead. I'll be positive, but this is just the way we illustrated it. So action D here, point D, picking reserve price at point D, this has a higher probability of keeping the good than point C, but also has a lower transfer. It's closer to 0 in absolute value. And so what that means is a seller who picked point D must want to keep the good more than a seller who picked the reserve price at point C. And that's illustrated by the slopes. The slope is higher at point D than at point C. So it's definitely a higher VS, higher value for the seller. The same thing goes over here where we have at point A, this has a lower probability of keeping the good, lower on the x-axis, and a lower transfer. It's closer to 0. So that means that a seller who picked point A must really want to get rid of this item. They're getting paid less and they really don't want to keep it, which means that they had a low value for it. And that's what you see by a large negative slope relative to point B. This is the overall distribution of valuations we estimate for the sellers and relative to the buyer. And again, the buyer is super easy to estimate. That's just using traditional second order stat inversion from the auctions literature. So what I want to look at in this final minute here is this bargaining power. So typically people think of bargaining power in empirical literature as just the weight in a Nash bargaining problem, but that's abstracting away from private information. There's no great, there's not a lot of work, empirical work thinking about bargaining power in private information bargaining settings like we have here. So what we're going to do is we're going to estimate I'm going to skip to this part. We're going to estimate the total surplus, the seller's surplus, and the buyer's surplus. And then this is just the share of seller surplus in our real world bargaining, the one we see in the data, and also in the case where the seller got to make a take it or leave it offer, or the buyer gets to make a take it or leave it offer, or in the Meyerson-Satterthwaite efficient bargaining, second best efficient bargaining here. And all these units are in units of $1,000. What we can see here is that in this real world bargaining mechanism here, the seller is getting about 60% of the surplus. And that appears to favor the sellers. They're getting more than 50% of the surplus. But if they were to move this to efficient bargaining here, the seller would get 66%. They'd get even more of the surplus here than they're currently getting, which I think is kind of interesting, and we're hoping to explore this further. The surplus split would reverse if we gave the buyer the opportunity to make a take it or leave it offer here. The seller would only get 40% of the surplus. What's interesting is that if you look at what this is the seller optimal bargaining, and this is the buyer optimal bargaining, and the real world one is closer to efficient bargaining than either of these. 60% isn't that far from 66, which we think maybe is kind of reflecting some interesting ideas of this being a two-sided market. The auction house here is the one picking this mechanism and mediating the bargaining, and they really want to make this be more fair for buyers and sellers because they've got to attract both to the auction house. They don't want to have a mechanism that only is optimal for sellers or only for buyers. And again, we're looking forward to exploring this in more detail. We can also look at the number of bidders that were in the auction and how that affects the efficiency and the surplus split. So the more bidders in the auction, this yellow line says what share of the surplus is the seller getting. And you can see that the seller's bargaining power here, or surplus split, certainly increases the more bidders that were in the pre-bargaining stage, this auction, the more competitive that was. We can also see that the inefficiency described by Myers and Satterthwaite is going to bind less and less. That's what this blue line is. When it gets all the way to 100%, we're saying that there's no Myers and Satterthwaite gap. That just kind of goes away as the number of bidders in the auction, in the pre-bargaining stage, gets bigger and bigger. And in conclusion, then I just want to say this: we think this approach has various applications, and we're certainly making some strong assumptions here. We're assuming risk neutrality, which Shosh is certainly being able to avoid. So we're focusing on mainly this being an application for complicated games like bargaining or multi-stage auctions where otherwise don't have identification arguments. Here's a way we can apply it, and that's all I got. I hope Anthony's actively answered. So I guess the one question we had. All right, I don't know if we have time to answer any questions now.
I think we have a couple of minutes. We started a little late. I didn't see any questions, but maybe I didn't look at the right spot. Let's see. No open questions. Okay. So thanks to you as well for a very entertaining and informative talk. I enjoyed it a lot. A couple of questions that came to my mind is, at the beginning you were emphasizing a lot that you just need to observe the action or an action taken, but you also need to observe, I mean, you made it clear down the track, you also have to observe the action set, right?
The action set?
Yeah, so what is the available set of actions? Or
well, we only need to know whatever ones are in the data. We need to, so the only one thing that's nice about this is we only need to estimate the menu at the points that ever got picked in the data. We don't need to know anything about actions that were available to them that no one ever picked, because they couldn't have been on the menu. If they weren't ever picked, they couldn't have been on the frontier of the menu. So like that in that illustration I showed, there was that point that was on the interior. I don't even need to know that point even exists from my empirical standpoint, because it's never optimal for anyone, and the only thing we know is the frontier ones, and anything that gets observed in the data must be on the frontier.
Okay, let me rephrase. You need to observe alternative actions. Yeah.
I would certainly need to, yes, it would need to be a case that across, but only across, for a given observation, I don't need to know what other things you could have picked. I formed that set by looking in my data, and yes, in my data it has to be the case
that actions that are taken, yeah.
Yeah, you need at least three, there needs to be at least three actions, in fact, in order to be able to have this work. There need to be at least three possible actions that the agents could pick. Otherwise, couldn't get any sort of bound on any agent's value.
And you're really just leveraging incentive compatibility and risk neutrality. Right. These are the two things that drive. It's very neat. For the auction houses application, my question was, well, how does the auction house make money?
They get paid. They pick the fee structure, and the way they pick it is that it's mainly when trade occurs. There's a commission they take a fixed, mostly a flat fee from the buyer and a flat fee from the seller when they agree. But there's a little bit of commission for the buyer, but mainly it's a flat fee.
So the one thing you didn't look at is what will be the intermediate optimal. That wasn't a counterfactual I saw there on the application. What's the intermediate optimal mechanism?
So we look at that. I look at that separately in a separate paper called the efficiency of bargaining. So on my website, it's solo author paper there, and I don't focus on it there. I think it's in an appendix there too, because it ends up being such a lower probability of trade that it results in. It just seems very unrealistic that the auction house would pick it, and I think that's because of competition among platforms. There's a given auction house couldn't pick the monopoly broker fee, because it would drive everybody to other platforms instead.
Okay, Yeah.
I think it'd be very interesting to separately think about what would be in a market where multiple platforms are competing, what would be the optimal fee, and
well,
and I think it drives it pretty. It might be. I think it drives it pretty low to close to cost. I think so. I think they're behaving more as though they are trying to maximize welfare than trying to maximize the amount they can get in fees.
Well, yeah, I suppose it boils down to something like a second best mechanism. You want to cover some fixed cost or leave enough utility to the participants so that they're still willing to come. There was one last thing that I wasn't quite sure. I mean, not that I understood everything else, but there's one more thing that I wasn't perfectly clear about when you talked about bargaining power. When you say the seller gets a greater surplus, greater share of the surplus when there's more buyers. But I would be a little reluctant to see that as a decrease in bargaining power, because the bargaining power should show up in the one-to-one bargaining. The other is just a mechanical competition effect, if you know what I mean.
So it's shift. You're right. So it's shifting. It's more. I'm using surplus split and bargaining power as though they're synonymous, but they're not really. So I should just really say surplus split. That's really what it's about. And that surplus split, the seller, when there's more competitors in the buy. So we're in the bilateral bargaining part after the auction. When there were more competitors in the auction than in that bilateral bargaining part, the seller's just facing a more favorable distribution of the buyer type there. The buyer is the buyer in the bargaining is the highest value bidder, and that's going to be that's going to be coming from a higher distribution each time. So yeah, you're right. I should just call it surplus split.
Exactly. All right. Cool. I enjoyed both of these talks, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. Thank you all for coming, and hope to see you in reality sometime soon, somewhere.
Thanks for organizing.
Yeah. See you soon.